The cabin lights flickered as the Boeing 737 lurched hard to the right, sending a tray of plastic cups skittering down the aisle and a chorus of gasps rippling through the recycled air. Rain lashed the windows, each drop a sharp tap against the fuselage, like impatient knuckles on a door that wouldn't open. Somewhere over the Rocky Mountains, the flight from Seattle, Washington to Denver, Colorado had stumbled into a beast of a storm, the kind that made even seasoned travelers clutch their armrests. The intercom crackled a nervous edge to the flight attendant's voice, cutting through the hum of engines and the low rumble of thunder. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Sarah Brooks, your lead flight attendant. We're experiencing severe turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The plane shuddered again, a violent jolt that rattled overhead bins and sent a laptop bag tumbling from a seat in row 15. A child's wail pierced the cabin sharp and raw, answered by a mother's hurried shushing. Elias Eli Carter, tucked into seat 32C, pressed his forehead against the cold window, watching lightning claw the sky in jagged white arcs. His threadbare jacket, patched at the elbows and smelling faintly of campfire smoke, did little to ward off the airplane's chill. His beard, streaked with gray, framed a face that hadn't seen a razor in months, and his boots, scuffed and cracked, rested on a backpack that held everything he owned. A spare shirt, a dog-eared paperback, a half-empty water bottle, and 3 pennies he kept for luck. He hadn't planned to be here on this flight in this storm. A week ago, Emily Grant, a gate agent at SeaTac Airport, who'd seen him sweeping floors at a shelter where she volunteered, had pressed a voucher into his calloused hand. "It expires tonight, Eli," she'd said, her eyes soft but firm, the kind that saw through the dirt to the man underneath. "There's a job in Denver if you can get there. Construction, steady work." He'd almost torn the voucher up, spooked by the clean lines of the airport and the polished shoes of people who belonged there. But Emily's voice had stayed with him, steady as a lighthouse. And now here he was, folded into a seat too small for his frame, trying to be invisible. The plane dropped again, a sickening plunge that made oxygen masks quiver in their panels and drew a scream from someone in the back. The intercom sparked to life once more this time, with a voice that was younger, shakier, almost pleading. "This is First Officer Mia Torres. We have a medical emergency in the cockpit. The captain is unconscious. If there's anyone on board with military or fighter pilot experience, please identify yourself immediately." The cabin went still, the kind of quiet that follows a thunderclap, every head-turning eyes searching for a savior in the dim light. Eli's stomach twisted. He closed his eyes, willing the words to belong to someone else's life. He hadn't touched a cockpit in years, not since Afghanistan, not since the crash that took his crew and left him with nightmares that smelled of burning fuel and sounded like screams. He'd sworn off flying, sworn off the sky that had chewed him up and spit him out. But the plane lurched again, and the child's cry grew louder, a small voice calling for a father who wasn't there. Eli's hands, rough and scarred, tightened on the armrests, muscle memory stirring like an old wound. He didn't want to stand. He didn't want to remember. But the intercom begged again, Mia's voice cracking. "Now please, anyone with military aviation experience, we need you now." In first class, a man in a tailored suit, James Carver, half stood his polished watch, catching the flickering light. "I've flown Cessna's private jets dozens of times," he announced, voice loud with the confidence of someone used to boardrooms. "I can help. Sarah Brooks." The lead flight attendant sprinted toward him, her face tight with strain. "Sir, we need military experience, combat, or heavy aircraft." Carver's jaw tightened, his ego bruised. "Flying's flying," he snapped, but another jolt cut him off, slamming luggage doors with a metallic screech that silenced his protest. Sarah's eyes, darted across the cabin, searching, desperate. I swallowed hard, his throat dry as sand. His hands knew things his mind wanted to forget. Throttles, trim wheels, the cadence of checklists barked over the roar of rotors in a desert storm. He unbuckled his seatbelt, the red-fastened seatbelt sign glaring like an accusation. A woman in row 31 hissed, "Sit down, you're making it worse." Eli ignored her, his knees steady despite the hammering in his chest. Faces turned, some curious, some scornful, as he moved up the aisle. His boots heavy on the carpet, his jacket stained with coffee from a shelter's urn. Carver barked from first class. "Back to your seat, buddy. This isn't your show." Sarah stepped between them, her eyes meeting Eli's, not unkind, but sharp with urgency. "Sir, do you have relevant experience?" Eli's voice was low, rough like gravel underfoot. "Marine Corps CH-53 helos 10 years ago." She studied him for a beat, her gaze flickering over his ragged appearance, then nodded as another shudder rocked the plane. "Come with me. Hurry." The aisle parted like a reluctant sea passenger's clutching seatbacks as the plane tilted. Eli felt their stares, disbelief, judgment, a few flickers of hope. Behind the reinforced cockpit door, the world narrowed to a chaos of blinking lights and alarms. Mia Torres, barely 30, sweat beading on her forehead, gripped the yoke with white knuckles. Her nameplate glinted under the dim cockpit glow. Captain Robert Bob Lawson slumped in his seat. Oxygen mask pressed to his face, eyelids fluttering. "Hypoglycemia, maybe a stroke," Mia stammered, her voice tight. "I can't raise ATC, the storm's blocking everything. I've never—" She cut herself off as the plane bucked again, instruments screaming. Eli's hands found the back of the captain's seat, steady as if he'd been here yesterday, not a decade ago. "Breathe," he told Mia, his voice flattening into the calm of someone who'd flown through worse. "Tell me what you've got." Mia gulped air, glancing at the panels. Mach 0.78, 37,000 feet. Crosswind, shear severe. Weather radar's a mess. Eli nodded his eyes, scanning the instruments like old friends. He reached out, silencing a non-critical alarm with a flick of his fingers. "We're not outrunning this storm," he said softly. "We go through it, find a gap, and get down fast." Mia blinked, startled by his calm. Through Eli pointed at the radar scope, where a faint notch of lighter green flickered between angry red cells. "There. It's thin, but it's a door. We take it now or we get torn apart." Mia hesitated, then nodded, her hands tightening on the yoke. Eli didn't touch the controls, he couldn't, not legally, but his fingers hovered, guiding Mia with words. "Small inputs, keep the nose steady. Trim it out. Don't fight the wind." The plane groaned, metal creaking, as it battled the storm's fists. In the cabin, Sarah's voice came over the intercom, steadier now. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have assistance in the cockpit. Please remain seated." A collective exhale rippled through the cabin, though fear still hung heavy. A woman in row 25 crossed herself, lips moving silently. A teenager in 19B recorded the chaos on his phone, the red dot of his camera blinking like a judgmental eye. James Carver muttered, "We're done if the drifter's running the show loud enough for his wife to nudge him sharply." A child. Lily Parker in row 22 clutched her mother's hand and whispered, "Is he a hero?" "Mommy." Her mother shushed, her tears in her eyes, unsure how to answer. Back in the cockpit, Eli B's gaze stayed locked on the radar, his voice a metronome. "Left 5 degrees, hold it trimmed down 2. Mia obeyed, her hands shaking less with each command. The storm roared outside, lightning painting the windshield in stark white flashes. But Eli's calm was a tether pulling Mia back from panic. He remembered nights in Afghanistan, flying through sandstorms so thick they chewed paint off the chopper, his crew joking through chattering teeth to keep fear at bay. He remembered the crash, the one that ended it all, rotors failing, the ground rushing up, the silence afterward, louder than any explosion. He'd promised himself no more cockpits, no more skies. But the sky had found him again in a soup kitchen line, in Emily's voucher, in this storm that didn't care about his promises. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence so sharp it felt like a punch, and Mia gasped, her hands jerking on the yoke. "Easy, Eli," said his voice, a blade cutting through her fear. "Ride it. Don't chase it. Let the plane settle." Mia nodded, her breathing evening out. The radar showed the gap narrowing, the storm's edges clawing closer. Eli leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Fuel status." Mia checked, her voice steadier now. "Good for Denver reserves, for Colorado Springs or Cheyenne if we need them." Eli nodded. "Keep Cheyenne in your pocket." Storms lie. He remembered an instructor's voice, gravelly, from too many cigars. "Fly the plane, son, not the weather." The memory steadied him even as the plane shuddered again, ice forming in delicate webs on the windshield wipers. "Anti-ice," on Eli said, and Mia flipped the switch, her movements surer now. The cockpit felt smaller, the world outside a black void streaked with silver rain. Eli glanced at Bob Lawson, still slumped, his chest rising and falling under the oxygen mask. "Pulse is there," Eli said, not quite gentle, not quite rough. "Keep him warm." He stripped off his own jacket, the one Emily had teased him about. "Looks like it flew through a war, Eli," and draped it over Bob's knees. Mia stared, her eyes flicking from the jacket to Eli's face. "You don't," she started, but Eli cut her off. "He's the one who lands us if I'm wrong. Let's not test fate." The storm didn't relent, but it paused, as if catching its breath. The radar showed the gap holding just barely. Eli pointed. "That's our shot. Drop to 30,000, slow to 280 knots. We'll taste the air below." Mia hesitated, then nodded, easing the throttle back. The plane sighed, descending into a layer that felt less like a fist and more like a shove. Ice glittered on the wings, then shed in a crystalline shrug as they slipped through the altitude. The radios crackled static, swallowing half the words, but a faint voice broke through Denver Center, distant and garbled. Mia tried the guard frequency, got static, tried again. A weak signal flickered, then drowned in the storm's roar. "We're on our own for now," Eli said, his head tilted as if he could feel the wind through the steel. "Silent running. Check alternates. Colorado Springs, Cheyenne, maybe Casper?" Maya nodded, flipping through the flight plan with hands that no longer shook. Eli's calm was contagious, a quiet that spread like ripples. He hadn't wanted the weight of lives in his hands again. But the cockpit smelled of purpose, of necessity, and it woke something in him he'd buried under years of drifting. In the cabin, Sarah moved down the aisle, checking seatbelts, offering tight smiles. A man in row 10, Tom Reynolds, a grizzled veteran with a faded army tattoo, caught her eye. "I've seen worse," he said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Desert storm, we flew through sand. That'd choke a camel. That guy up there knows what he's doing." Sarah nodded, grateful for the anchor his words provided. Lily Parker. The girl in row 22 tugged her mother's sleeve. "Is the man in the old coat a pilot?" Her mother, eyes red, whispered, "I hope so, baby." James Carver, in first class, crossed his arms, his wife's hand resting lightly on his wrist. "If he's who they're betting on, we're in trouble," he muttered, but his voice lacked the earlier venom. The plane steadied for a moment, and a few passengers dared to hope, their prayers softening into whispers. Eli in the cockpit felt none of it. His world was the radar, the altimeter, the faint green notch that promised a way out. "Good," he murmured as much to Mia as to the plane. "Now, let's find the ground." The Boeing 737 groaned under the weight of the storm, its frame shuddering as wind shear battered the wings like a boxer working a heavy bag. Rain streaked the cockpit windshield in relentless silver rivers, blurring the black void beyond where lightning flickered like a pulse in the clouds. Elias Eli Carter stood behind the co-pilot's seat, his calloused hands gripping the seat back steady as a man who'd flown through worse. The cockpit was a claustrophobic world of flashing lights and insistent alarms, the air thick with the metallic tang of adrenaline and the faint hum of electronics fighting to be heard over the storm's roar. First Officer Mia Torres, her knuckles pale on the yoke, kept her eyes locked on the instruments, her breathing sharp but controlled, thanks to Eli's calm voice cutting through the chaos. "Small corrections." Mia Eli said, his tone low and even, like a man talking a horse through a gate. "Don't chase the wind. Let it come to you." Mia nodded, her hands easing on the controls, the plane responding with a reluctant sigh as it leveled out. The weather radar painted a grim picture, a wall of red and yellow cells with only a sliver of green, a fleeting gap in the storm over the Rocky Mountains that promised a way through. But the gap was shrinking, and the plane was running out of time. Eli's eyes flicked to the captain, Robert Bob Lawson, still slumped in his seat, oxygen mask fogging with shallow breaths. His pulse was steady, but his face was gray. A reminder that this wasn't just about the storm, it was about getting 142 souls to Denver, Colorado, alive. The intercom crackled, and Sarah Brooks, the lead flight attendant, relayed a message from the cabin. "Folks are getting restless, Mia. Some guy in first class is demanding to know who's up there with you." Mia's jaw tightened, but she didn't look away from the instruments. "Let them talk," she muttered. "We've got bigger problems." Eli glanced at the radar again, the green notch flickering like a candle in a draft. "Fuel?" he asked. Mia checked, her voice steadier now. "Enough for Denver with Colorado Springs as primary alternate. Cheyenne's a stretch if this gets worse." Eli nodded, his mind running through old checklists from his Marine Corps days, flying CH-53 helicopters through sandstorms that chewed through rotor blades. "Keep springs in your head. We're not out of this yet." The plane lurched again, a sudden drop that sent a pen skittering across the cockpit floor. Mia corrected, her hands smoother now, learning to trust the plane's responses. But then a new alarm blared, a sharp, insistent beep that made Eli's stomach clench. "Engine 1's acting up," Mia said, her voice spiking as she scanned the gauges. "Power's fluctuating, looks like icing." Eli leaned closer, his eyes narrowing at the engine readouts. "Anti-ice is on right." Mia nodded, but the gauge showed a dip in thrust, the left engine stuttering under the storm's icy grip. "We can't lose it," she said, panic creeping into her voice. Eli's hand hovered near the controls, instinct screaming to take over, but he pulled back. "You've got this," he said. "Reduce power on one balance with two. We'll limp through the gap." Mia adjusted the throttles, her movements deliberate, and the plane steadied, though the engine's hum felt uneven like a heart-skipping beats. Eli's mind flashed to Afghanistan, a night when his chopper's engine coughed in a sandstorm, his crew chief cursing through the headset, while Eli nursed the bird back to base. He shook the memory off, focusing on the radar. "That gap's closing," he said, pointing to the screen. "Drop to 28,000, slow to 270 knots. We need to thread this needle now." Mia hesitated, her eyes flicking to the altimeter, then back to Eli. "That's low for this terrain." Eli's voice stayed calm, almost gentle. "We're clear of the peaks. Trust the scope." Mia swallowed, then eased the plane down the descent, smooth but tense, the storm's fists pounding the fuselage. The cabin intercom buzzed again and Sarah's voice came through, clipped but professional. "Mia, we've got a passenger who says she's an engineer. She's offering to help with weather data if you need it." Eli's eyebrows lifted. Engineer Mia nodded, keying the mic. "Send her up, Sarah." A minute later, the cockpit door opened, and Nora Hayes stepped in, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, her laptop bag slung over one shoulder. She was in her late 30s, dressed in jeans and a sweater, her eyes sharp, despite the plane's rocking. "Nora Hayes," she said, extending a hand to Eli, then Mia. "I'm an aerospace engineer, worked on 737 systems at Boeing. I've got weather data on my tablet, real-time Doppler from a satellite feed." Eli studied her for a beat, then nodded. "Show me." Nora knelt beside the co-pilot's seat, pulling up a map that showed the storm's structure in vivid detail, swirling cells of red and purple with a narrow corridor of calmer air to the southeast. "This matches your radar," she said, pointing to the green notch. "But it's moving fast. You've got maybe 10 minutes before it closes." Eli's mouth tugged into a faint smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. 10 minutes is plenty." He turned to Mia. "See that ridge on the scope? Aim for it. Shallow descent, keep it smooth." Mia nodded, her hands steadier now, guided by Eli's voice and Nora's data. The plane dipped, the storm's roar softening for a moment as they slipped into the gap. But the engine alarm beeped again, sharper this time, and Mia's eyes widened. "Engine 1's losing thrust," she said. "We're at 80%. Eli's jaw tightened. "Can you compensate?" Mia adjusted the throttle on engine 2, but the plane yawed slightly, the uneven power making it sluggish. "It's fighting me," she said, her voice tight. Nora glanced at her tablet, then at the engine readouts. "Could be ice in the intake. Try cycling the anti-ice system off for 10 seconds, then back on." Eli nodded. "Do it." Mia flipped the switch, the cockpit falling silent except for the storm's drumbeat outside. 10 seconds felt like an hour, the plane trembling as the engine coughed, then steadied. When Mia switched the anti-ice back on, the thrust gauge climbed slowly, stabilizing at 90%. Better, Mia breathed, her shoulders dropping an inch. Eli's eyes stayed on the radar, the green notch now a thin thread. "Good call, Nora. Stay with us." Nora nodded, her tablet balanced on her knee as she tracked the storm's movement. The plane was holding, but the storm wasn't done. A sudden gust slammed them sideways, and Mia gasped, correcting instinctively. Small inputs, Eli reminded her, his voice a lifeline. "You're flying, not wrestling." Mia nodded, her focus sharpening, the plane responding like a reluctant partner, learning to dance. In the cabin, Sarah moved through the aisle, her calm, a practiced shield against the passenger's fear. James Carver. The first-class passenger was on his feet again, his face red. "Who's this guy in the cockpit?" "Some bum off the street. I paid for professionals, not a charity case." Sarah's voice was firm, cutting through his bluster. "Sir, sit down. The man up there is a former Marine pilot. He's keeping us in the air." Carver's wife Ellen touched his arm, her voice soft but pointed. "James, enough." He sat scowling, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt, maybe shame. In row 22, Lily Parker. The little girl with wide eyes clutched her mother's hand. "Mommy, is the man in the coat going to save us?" Her mother. Claire wiped her eyes. "He's trying, sweetheart." Tom Reynolds, the veteran in row 10, leaned toward them, his voice steady. "I flew in worse than this in 91. Guy like that, he's been through hell and back. Trust him." Claire nodded, her grip on Lily tightening. A teenager in 19B, still filming with his phone, whispered to his seatmate, "This is gonna go viral." But his hands shook the red dot on his camera, wavering. Back in the cockpit, the radios crackled with static. Denver Center's voice faint and broken. "Oceanic 214, say position, severe weather, vectors." The signal drowned in noise, and Mia's face fell. "We're still cut off," she said. Eli tilted his head, listening to the storm's rhythm through the fuselage. "Try guard frequency again," he said. "If that fails, we relay through another bird." Mia switched channels, her voice steady as she called out, "Any station, this is Oceanic 214 emergency requesting relay to Denver Center." Static answered, then a faint voice. "A cargo pilot may be breaking through. Oceanic 214, this is Freight Dog 19. I hear you. Stand by." The signal flickered, but it was something. Eli nodded. "Good. Keep trying." Nora's tablet showed the storm shifting, the gap narrowing to a thread. "We've got maybe 5 minutes," she said, her voice calm but urgent. Eli's eyes flicked to the altimeter, then the radar. Mia dropped to 25,260 knots. "We're going through now." Mia's hands moved the plane, descending into a layer of air that felt less angry, though the storm still clawed at them. Ice glittered on the wings, then melted as the anti-ice system hummed. The engine stabilized, but the uneven thrust made every maneuver a gamble. Eli's mind drifted to a night in Helmand Province, his chopper limping back to base with a shot-up tail rotor, his co-pilot bleeding out in the seat beside him. He'd landed that bird, but not everyone walked away. The memory stung, but it also sharpened him, reminding him what was at stake. "You're doing good, Mia," he said, his voice a quiet anchor. "Picture the runway in Denver. Build it in your head. Centerline lights the works." Mia nodded, her lips pressed tight, her eyes flicking between the instruments and the windshield where rain and lightning painted a world of chaos. Nora's tablet beeped a new weather update, loading. "The gap's holding, but there's a cell forming to the east," she said. "We need to bank left, maybe 10 degrees. Eli nodded. "Do it, Mia." "Left 10, hold the descent." The plane tilted the turn smooth despite the storm's protests. The cabin lights flickered again, and Sarah's voice came over the intercom, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're navigating through the weather. Please, keep your seatbelts fastened. We're in good hands." A few passengers exhaled their prayers, softening, but James Carver muttered, "Good hands. That guy looks like he sleeps under a bridge." Ellen squeezed his hand, her voice sharp. "Stop it, James. He's up there, not you." The plane hit another pocket of turbulence, a sharp jolt that rattled the overhead bins and drew a gasp from Mia. "Stay with it," Eli said, his voice unwavering. "Trim it out, small corrections." Mia adjusted the plane, settling as she found the rhythm. Nora's tablet showed the gap, narrowing, the storm's edges closing like jaws. 3 minutes, she said, her voice tight. Eli's eyes stayed on the radar, the green thread now a faint whisper. "We're almost through," he said. "Keep the nose down, 250 knots." The plane obeyed, slipping through the storm's weakest point, the turbulence easing for a moment, like a predator pausing to breathe. Eli glanced at Bob Lawson, whose eyelids fluttered, a small groan escaping under the oxygen mask. "He's coming back," Eli said, checking his pulse. "Keep him on oxygen, Mia. He'll need to be sharp when we land." Mia nodded, her focus split between the yoke and the captain's condition. The radios crackled again, Denver Center's voice clearer now. "Oceanic 214. This is Denver Center. We have you. Say intentions." Mia grabbed the mic, her voice steady. "Denver Center, Oceanic 214, Captain incapacitated, requesting vectors for priority descent." The controller's voice was calm, professional. Roger. Oceanic 214, stand by for vectors. Eli exhaled the first breath he'd noticed in minutes. The storm wasn't done, but they'd found a crack in its armor. In the cabin, Sarah knelt beside Lily Parker, tucking a blanket around her. "We're going to be okay, sweetie," she said, her voice soft but sure. Lily's eyes were wide. "Is the man in the coat a hero?" Sarah smiled, her throat tight. "He's trying to be." Tom Reynolds. The veteran leaned back, his eyes distant. "Reminds me of a guy in my unit," he said to no one in particular. "Didn't look like much, but he'd pull you out of a fire." The teenager in 19B lowered his phone, the red dot off, now his hands still. James Carver stared out the window, his jaw working as if chewing on words he couldn't spit out. The plane steadied, the turbulence softening to a dull roar. And for the first time, hope felt like something tangible, not just a prayer whispered in the dark. Eli in the cockpit felt the shift too, the plane finding a smoother layer of air. "Good," he murmured, his voice almost lost in the hum of the engines. "Now let's keep it together and find the ground." The storm still raged, but they were through the worst of it, and for the first time in hours, the sky felt like it might forgive them. The Boeing 737 trembled as it sliced through the thinning edge of the storm, the roar of the Rocky Mountain squall, now a sullen growl rather than a scream. Inside the cockpit, Elias Eli Carter stood steady behind First Officer Mia Torres, his eyes flicking between the weather radar and the altimeter where needles danced in a delicate balance of hope and caution. The green notch on the radar, their lifeline through the tempest, was fading, but they'd slipped into a layer of air that felt less like a fist fight and more like a grudging truce. Mia's hands, once white-knuckled, now moved with a cautious grace on the yoke, guided by Eli's low, steady voice. "Keep it smooth, Mia." Small inputs let the plane breathe. Nora Hayes, the aerospace engineer, knelt beside them, her tablet glowing with real-time weather data, a faint lifeline to the world beyond the storm's grip. The engine that had stuttered earlier hummed unevenly, but held, and Captain Robert Bob Lawson, still slumped in his seat, stirred faintly under the oxygen mask, his breathing steadier but his eyes unfocused. The cabin, though, was a different world, a stew of fear, hope, and whispered stories that wove through the recycled air like threads in a fraying tapestry. The passengers strapped into their seats were no longer just strangers on a flight from Seattle to Denver. They were a fragile community bound by the shared terror of a plane caught in a storm, and the unlikely figure of a ragged man in the cockpit. In row 22, Lily Parker, a girl of 7 with wide brown eyes, clutched her mother Claire's hand, her small fingers digging into her mother's palm. "Mommy, is the man in the old coat going to make the plane land?" "Okay," she asked, her voice small but piercing, cutting through the low hum of the engines. Claire, her face pale and streaked with worry, brushed a strand of hair from Lily's forehead. "He's trying, baby. He's trying really hard." She glanced toward the cockpit door, as if she could will strength through the reinforced steel to the stranger who'd stepped up when no one else could. Across the aisle, Tom Reynolds, a grizzled Army veteran with a faded tattoo of a parachute on his forearm, leaned forward, his voice rough but kind. "Kid, I knew guys like him in Iraq. Didn't look like much boots falling apart gear held together with duct tape, but they'd fly through hell to get you home. He's got this." Lily's eyes widened and she nodded solemnly, as if Tom's words were a promise she could hold on to. Claire mouthed a silent thank you to Tom, her shoulders easing just a fraction. In first class, James Carver, the businessman who'd earlier scoffed at Eli's appearance, sat rigid, his tailored suit wrinkled from gripping the armrests. His wife Ellen rested her hand on his, her touch gentle but firm. James, you saw him walk up there. He didn't hesitate even with everyone staring. James's jaw worked, his eyes fixed on the seat back in front of him. Doesn't mean he knows what he's doing, he muttered, but his voice lacked the earlier venom softened by the plane's steadier flight and the weight of his wife's quiet rebuke. In the galley, Sarah Brooks, the lead flight attendant, moved with practiced calm, checking seat belts and offering water to passengers whose hands shook too much to hold the cups steady. A teenager in row 19. Ethan had stopped filming the chaos with his phone, the red dot of his camera finally dark. He leaned toward his seatmate, an elderly woman named Ruth Coleman, who clutched a worn rosary. "Do you think we're going to make it?" Ethan asked, his voice low, almost embarrassed. Ruth's eyes sharp, despite her age, met his. "Boy, I lived through the Blitz in London as a girl. Bombs falling, houses burning, and we kept going. This storm's bad, but that man up there, he's not running away. That's enough for now." Ethan nodded, his hands folding in his lap, the phone unforgotten. Sarah paused by Ruth's seat, catching the tail end of her words. "You're keeping us grounded, Ruth," she said softly, and Ruth's mouth curved into a small smile. "Somebody's got to," she replied, her fingers sliding over the rosary beads, each one a prayer for stubborn people in a stubborn sky. Back in the cockpit, the radios crackled with static. Denver Center's voice still faint, but growing clearer as the plane descended to 25,000 feet. "Oceanic, 214 Denver Center. We have you. Maintain heading 210, descend to 20,000. Expect vectors for Denver." Mia keyed the mic, her voice steady now, a far cry from the trembling plea that had begged for help an hour ago. "Denver Center, Oceanic 214, heading 210, descending to 20,000, thank you." Eli nodded, his eyes on the radar, where the green notch was now a faint whisper, the storm's edges closing in again. "Good," he said, his voice a quiet anchor. "We're through the worst, but don't get comfortable." Nora's tablet beeped a new weather update, loading. "There's a cell forming to the west," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "We need to adjust right, maybe 15 degrees to stay in the clear." Eli glanced at the screen, then at Mia. "Do it. Right 15, keep the descent shallow." Mia turned the yoke, the plane banking smoothly, the storm's roar softening as they slipped into calmer air. But the uneven hum of the left engine reminded them that the plane wasn't out of danger. "Engine 1's at 85%. Mia said, her eyes flicking to the gauges. "It's holding, but I don't like it." Eli's jaw tightened, his mind racing through old helicopter checklists where every flight was a gamble with dust and heat. "Monitor it," he said. "If it drops below 80, we divert to Colorado Springs." Eli's thoughts drifted unbidden to a night in Afghanistan, a mission to extract a wounded squad under fire. His CH-53 had taken shrapnel, the cockpit smelling of smoke and fear, his co-pilot's voice steady despite the blood soaking his flight suit. They'd made it back, but not all of them, and the weight of that failure had followed Eli into the streets, into shelters, into the bottom of bottles he'd sworn off years ago. He shook the memory loose, focusing on Mia's hands, which now moved with a quiet confidence. "You're doing good," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Stay with the plane, not the storm." Mia nodded, her lips pressed tight, her eyes scanning the instruments. Nora's voice broke the silence. "Eli, you said Marine Corps, right?" "Helos." Eli's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. CH-53s, mostly. Big, ugly birds that didn't care about weather or bullets. Nora's eyes softened. "Sounds like you've seen worse than this." Eli didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the radar, but his silence said enough. Nora didn't push her fingers, tapping her tablet as she updated the weather data. "We've got about 8 minutes before that western cell catches us," she said. Keep this heading, and we might stay ahead. In the cabin, the passengers' stories began to surface like bubbles rising in still water. Tom Reynolds, the veteran, turned to the man next to him, a nervous accountant named Greg Harper. "You ever been in a storm like this?" Tom asked, his voice a low rumble. Greg shook his head, his glasses fogging from sweat. "Never. I hate flying. Only took this trip for a job interview." Tom chuckled a dry, weathered sound. "I flew into Baghdad in '03 C-130, bouncing like a tin can. Pilot was a kid barely 25, but he landed us in a dust storm so thick you couldn't see the wings. This guy up there, he's got that same look. Quiet, but he knows." Greg nodded, clutching his briefcase like a shield, his fear easing just enough to listen. In row 25, a young nurse, Maria Diaz, whispered a prayer in Spanish, her hands folded over a small cross necklace. The man next to her, an off-duty firefighter named Derek Walsh, offered a tired smile. "You praying for us or the pilot?" he asked. Maria's eyes crinkled. "Both. And the plane. It's doing its best." Derek nodded, his own hand steady, despite the turbulence. "I've pulled people out of burning buildings. This feels like that, except we're all in the fire together." Maria's smile was small but warm. "Then we trust the man putting it out." In first class, James Carver's scowl softened as he watched Ellen twist her wedding ring, a nervous habit he'd known for 20 years. "I was wrong about him," he said suddenly, his voice low, almost lost in the engine's hum. Ellen's eyes met his, surprised but gentle. "You didn't know, James." "None of us did." James shook his head, his jaw tight. "I saw the coat, the beard, and I thought, I don't know what I thought. But he's up there, and I'm not." Ellen squeezed his hand, her voice soft. "That's enough for now." Ams nodded, his eyes drifting to the cockpit door, where a man he'd dismissed as a drifter was holding their lives together with words and memory. In the galley, Sarah caught a moment to breathe, leaning against the counter as she listened to the passengers' voices, some praying, some talking, some silent. She thought of her own father, a mechanic who'd worked on 737s for 30 years, his hands always stained with grease, but steady as stone. "Planes are tough," he'd told her once. "They'll forgive a lot if you treat them right." She hoped the man in the cockpit knew that too. Back in the cockpit, Eli's voice crackled through the headset as he spoke to Nora. "What's the cell doing?" Nora's fingers flew over her tablet. "It's shifting west, but we're clear for another 5 minutes. After that, we'll hit chop again." Eli nodded, his eyes on the horizon, where a faint smear of gray hinted at calmer air. "Mia is it to 22,250 knots. We're almost through." Mia adjusted the controls, the plane responding with a grudging grace. The radio sparked to life again, Denver Center's voice clearer now. "Oceanic 214, cleared to 18,000, expect localizer for runway 35L. Mia read back the clearance, her voice steady, almost professional. Eli's mouth twitched, a flicker of pride. He didn't voice. The engine's hum steadied the icing issue under control for now, but the storm wasn't done. A sudden gust rocked the plane, and Mia corrected her hands, quick but smooth. "Good, Eli," said, his voice a quiet drumbeat. "You're flying like you mean it." Mia's cheeks flushed, a small smile breaking through her focus. "Learned from a guy who sounds like he's done this before," she said, glancing at Eli. He didn't answer, his eyes on the instruments, but his silence felt like agreement. In the cabin, the passengers felt the shift, the turbulence softening to a gentle sway. Ruth Coleman, the elderly woman with the rosary, began humming a hymn, her voice thin but steady, a sound that carried to the seats around her. Maria the nurse joined in her voice soft but clear. And soon, a third voice. Derek's added a low harmony. The hymn wasn't loud, but it was enough to quiet the nervous chatter, to remind people that hope could be sung as well as prayed. Lily Parker, listening from row 22, whispered to her mother, "They're singing for the man in the coat, aren't they?" Claire nodded, tears in her eyes. "For all of us, sweetheart." Tom Reynolds leaned back, his eyes half closed, remembering a night in Iraq when his squad had sung to keep fear at bay, their voices raw but defiant. James Carver, in first class, listened to the hymn and felt something shift inside him, a crack in the armor of his pride. He thought of his father, a man who'd worked docks in Seattle, who'd taught him that respect wasn't bought with money but earned with action. He hadn't understood then. He was starting to now. In the cockpit, Eli felt the plane's rhythm, the way it moved with Mia's hands, the way it forgave the storm's insults. He thought of his old crew chief, a man with a laugh like gravel and a knack for keeping choppers in the air. Fly the machine, not the ghosts, he'd said once, and Eli had carried those words through every mission, even the one that broke him. Now they steadied him again. "Mia," he said, his voice soft but clear, "you're doing what I couldn't back then. You're keeping it together." Mia's eyes flicked to him, surprised, but she didn't ask. There wasn't time. The storm was still there lurking, and Denver was still miles away. But for the first time, the cockpit felt like a place where stories could end well, where ghosts could be quiet, if only for a moment. Eli looked at Nora, then at Mia, and nodded. "Let's get these people home." The Boeing 737 carved a fragile path through the fraying edges of the Rocky Mountain storm, its wings slicing through air that was no longer a fist, but still a stubborn shove. The cockpit was a cocoon of focused calm, where Elias Eli Carter stood behind First Officer Mia Torres, his voice a steady metronome guiding her hands on the yoke. The weather radar showed the storm's grip, loosening the green notch they'd fought for. Now a faint memory replaced by a smudge of gray that hinted at Denver's lights somewhere below. Nora Hayes, the aerospace engineer, knelt beside them, her tablet glowing with the last of her weather data, her eyes sharp despite the hours of tension. Captain Robert Bob Lawson stirred in his seat, his oxygen mask fogging with stronger breaths, his eyelids fluttering as if waking from a bad dream. The plane was descending through 18,000 feet. The turbulence, now a dull complaint rather than a scream, but the left engine's uneven hum reminded them that safety was still a promise, not a guarantee. Eli's eyes flicked between the instruments and the windshield, where rain streaked in thinning ribbons, revealing a world of wet velvet, punctuated by distant amber glows. "Mia, hold 210 degrees, 250 knots. He said, his voice low but firm, like a man who'd learned to trust machines over fate. "Picture the runway 35L centerline rabbit lights. Build it in your head." Mia nodded, her hands steady now, her earlier panic buried under Eli's calm and the plane's reluctant obedience. The radios crackled, Denver Center's voice cutting through with a hockey rink drawl. "Oceanic 214 cleared to 12,000. Expect ILS for 35L. Mia read back the clearance, her voice, clear, professional, a far cry from the trembling plea that had begged for help over the Rockies. In the cabin, the passengers felt the shift, the plane's sway softening to a gentle rock, like a boat finding calmer waters. Sarah Brooks, the lead flight attendant, moved through the aisle, her smile tight but genuine, as she checked seatbelts and offered quiet reassurances. In row 22, Lily Parker, the 7-year-old with wide eyes, pressed her nose to the window, tracing raindrops with a small finger. "Mommy, I see lights down there," she whispered to Claire. Her mother, whose face softened with cautious hope. "That's Denver, baby Claire," said her voice thick. "We're almost home." Across the aisle, Tom Reynolds, the Army veteran, leaned back, his hands folded over his faded tattoo. "Told you," he said to no one in particular, his voice rough but warm. Guy like that doesn't quit. In first class, James Carver sat silent. His tailored suit creased his wife Ellen's hand, resting lightly on his. He hadn't spoken since the hymn had filled the cabin, but his eyes were different now, softer, as if seeing something he'd missed before. Ellen squeezed his hand, her voice a whisper. "You okay, James?" He nodded, his jaw tight, not ready to voice the apology forming in his chest. In row 25, Maria Diaz, the nurse, clutched her cross necklace, her prayers now a soft hum of gratitude. Derek Walsh, the firefighter beside her, offered a tired grin. "Bet that guy up there's got stories we'll never hear," he said. Maria nodded, her eyes bright. "He's telling one now." In the cockpit, Eli felt the plane's rhythm, the way it responded to Mia's hands, the way it forgave the storm's last insults. The altimeter unwound in disciplined clicks, the plane descending through 12,000 feet, the air growing smoother, the rain less angry. But a sudden gust shouldered them hard to the right, a final jab from the storm, and Mia's hands tensed on the yoke. "Easy," Eli said, his voice a blade through her nerves. "Correct. Left small inputs. Don't chase it." Mia adjusted the plane settling, and Nora's tablet beeped with a final weather update. "Wind shear warning near the airport," Nora said, her voice calm but urgent. "Gusts up to 30 knots, right to left." Eli nodded, his eyes narrowing at the windshield, where the first faint strobes of Denver's approach lights flickered through the mist. Mia armed the glide slope. "Keep it tight." "We're landing this." Mia flipped the switches, her movements precise, the plane locking onto the ILS like a dog finding a scent. "Glide slope alive," she said, her voice steady but loud in the small cockpit. Eli's mouth twitched, a flicker of pride he didn't voice. "Good. You fly. I'll call." The radios crackled again, Denver Center's voice steady now. "Oceanic 214 cleared to land. 35L winds, 270 at 25, gusting 30. Mia read back the clearance, her hands firm on the yoke, the plane descending through 8,000 feet. Bob Lawson stirred again, his voice a rasp under the oxygen mask. "Mia, what's—" Eli leaned over, checking his pulse, his touch not gentle but sure. "Captain, you had a spell. Mia's flying. We're on approach for Denver. Stay with the oxygen." Bob's eyes focused, confusion giving way to a commander's instinct. "You? Who?" He croaked, his gaze landing on Eli's ragged jacket, his gray-streaked beard. Eli's voice was quiet but firm. "Just a guy who didn't stay seated. Mia's got the plane, you've got the radios." Bob nodded weakly, his hand fumbling for the mic. "Denver, Oceanic 214, with you, 8,000. The controller's voice was a balm, familiar and calm. "Roger, Oceanic 214. Good to hear you, Captain. Cleared to land." Eli glanced at Mia, then Nora. "We're almost there. Keep it steady." In the cabin, Sarah's voice came over the intercom, honey over a bruise. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final descent into Denver. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened low and tight. We'll be on the ground soon." A ripple of relief passed through the cabin, though fear still lingered in the tight grips on armrests, the whispered prayers, the wide-eyed stares. Ruth Coleman, the elderly woman in row 19, stopped humming her hymn and opened her eyes, her rosary still in her hands. She remembered London in 1940, the air raid sirens, the way her mother had held her, and promised the bombs wouldn't find them. God uses the broken ones, she whispered to herself, thinking of the man in the cockpit, his coat more patches than fabric. Ethan, the teenager beside her, tucked his phone away, his hands no longer shaking. "You think he's a hero?" he asked, his voice soft. Ruth's eyes crinkled. "Heroes don't always look like they do in movies, son." In row 22, Lily Parker clapped her hands, her small voice bright. "The man in the coat did it." Claire shushed her, but her own tears fell, relief breaking through like sunlight. Tom Reynolds chuckled, his eyes distant. "Kid's got it right," he said, his voice carrying to the seats around him. In first class, James Carver stood ignoring Sarah's gentle wave to sit. He wasn't trying to make a scene this time. He just needed to move, to feel like he was part of something bigger than his own fear. Ellen touched his sleeve. James let them work. He nodded, sitting slowly, his eyes on the cockpit door. "I was wrong," he said loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "I thought he was nothing. I was wrong." Ellen's hand found his, her grip warm, forgiving. Derek, the firefighter, leaned toward Maria. "Guy like that, he's got more guts than most of us combined." Maria nodded, her cross necklace glinting. "He's carrying more than we know." In the cockpit, the plane hit 5,000 feet. The approach lights now a clear line of strobes, the runway a faint promise through the rain. "Localizer captured Mia," said her voice a measured metronome. Eli's eyes stayed on the instruments, his voice steady. "Good. Keep the correction winds right to left. Don't fight it. Lean with it." Mia nodded, her hands moving with a grace she hadn't known she had. The plane shivered a gust, pushing them off course, but Mia corrected her movements, small, precise. "Stable," she said at 1,000 feet, her voice loud in her own ears. Eli's eyes flicked to the windshield where the runway lights glowed like a lifeline. "Continue," he said, his voice a quiet blessing, a permission he hadn't given in years. At 500 feet, the rain thickened, a final defiance from the storm, but the glide slope held the needles steady. "Minimums," Mia called, her voice sharp. "Runway in sight." Eli answered, his tone calm, final. "Land it." The flare was clean, the wheels kissing wet asphalt with a soft thump. The reverse thrusters roaring as the plane slowed, spoilers shrugging up like wings folding after a long flight. Mia's laugh broke free, half sob, half joy, then choked off as she remembered the radios. "Welcome back," Eli said, and it wasn't just to her. The cabin erupted in applause, shy at first, then stubborn, then unanimous. Sarah's eyes flooded, her laugh breaking through as she leaned against the galley counter. Lily Parker clapped until her hands hurt, her voice bright. "He did it." The man in the coat. Claire hugged her tight, tears streaming. Tom Reynolds grinned, his hands folded as if he'd known all along. James Carver stood again, this time, clapping, his face open, unguarded, an apology in his eyes he wasn't ready to voice. Ellen joined him, her hand on his arm, pride replacing worry. Ruth Coleman whispered a final prayer, her rosary still, her heart full. Derek and Maria exchanged a look, a shared relief that needed no words. The plane taxied to the gate, the jetway creeping forward like a cautious animal. Eli stepped back from the seat, his hands shaking now that they didn't need to be steady. He tucked them into his pockets, a trick he'd learned when adrenaline came calling. Mia turned, her eyes bright. "Eli, thank you." He shook his head. "You flew it. I just talked." Bob Lawson, now sitting up, pulled off his oxygen mask, his voice weak but clear. "You saved my crew," he said, his hand reaching for Eli's. Eli took it, his grip brief, awkward. "We saved them," he said, nodding to Mia and Nora. The cockpit door opened and Sarah was there, her eyes red but smiling. "They want to see you," she said to Eli. He hesitated, his boots heavy on the threshold, the cabin a sea of faces, tired, grateful, human. He stepped through, and the applause swelled again, less frantic now, more like a thank you that didn't need words. Lily Parker craned over her seat, waving. "You're the hero," she called, and Claire didn't shush her this time. Ruth Coleman pressed a tissue to her mouth, her voice soft. "Thank you, son." James Carver stepped forward, his hand outstretched, awkward but sincere. "I was wrong," he said, his voice low. "I'm sorry." Eli took his hand, then Ellen's, who added, "We're so grateful." Eli nodded, his throat tight, unused to gratitude that didn't come with a catch. At the gate, agents in high-visibility vests held back a small crowd of reporters, cameras flashing like lightning that wouldn't quit. Sarah and Mia formed a wedge, guiding Eli through the chaos. A reporter shouted, "Are you the passenger who landed the plane?" Eli flinched, his eyes on his boots, the black crescent of oil under one nail. Bob Lawson's voice, stronger, now cut through. "Give him space. He's one of us." The crowd hushed, and Eli felt the weight of their stares, not unkind, but heavy. In a small conference room, the airline's station manager, a man named Paul Harris, offered a handshake and a nervous smile. "Mr. Carter, on behalf of Oceanic Airlines, thank you. We'd like to offer." Eli raised a hand, his voice quiet. "Not yet." Paul blinked, thrown off script, but Mia stepped in. "He'll talk later. Let him breathe." The room smelled of coffee and carpet cleaner, and someone brought sandwiches nobody touched. A nurse checked Bob, pronouncing him stable but stubborn. Legal scribbled notes. PR drafted statements, and Eli sat on a folding chair, his backpack at his feet, the weight of the night settling like dust. The PR woman, Linda, spoke gently. "Mr. Carter, may we use your name in the press release?" Eli rubbed his beard, buying time. Names carried gravity he'd learned on streets and shelters in moments when giving one meant trouble. Mia caught his eye, her voice soft. "Your call, Eli." He inhaled, tasting rain and jet fuel. "Use it," he said. "But it's not about me. It's about people doing their jobs and a storm that gave us a break." Linda nodded, crossing out a line in her notes. Bob stood shaky but determined and shook Eli's hand again. "Jump seat's yours any time," he said. Eli's smile was small, private. "I won't push my luck." Mia grinned, her eyes wet. "You're not just a rumor anymore, Eli." He shrugged, the weight of their gratitude, both comfort and burden. By dawn, the storm had dwindled to a drizzle, and the airline offered Eli a hotel room, a car, a voucher for more flights. He took the room, pressed into his hand by Mia, who said simply, "Sleep." In the elevator, his reflection showed a man who looked like he'd been lost and found his coat a map of hard years, his eyes tired but alive. He slept without dreams, waking to a hunger that felt like purpose. The TV murmured headlines, "Homeless hero guides plane to safety," and Eli almost laughed at the capitalized compassion. He ate an apple from the hotel's courtesy basket, each bite a reminder to keep going. Downstairs, Mia waited with coffee and a bag of bagels, her smile bright. "Thought you'd run," she said, half teasing. Eli shrugged. "Run enough?" They sat by a window, watching taxis blur through the mist. Mia hesitated, then spoke. "Come to our training center. Talk to the new hires. Tell them what the manuals don't about fear, about keeping it together." Eli stared at his coffee steam curling like a question. "I'm no teacher," he said. Mia leaned in. "You were last night." Eli used the airline's voucher to visit a sister in Tacoma, a woman with their mother's eyes, and a laugh that felt like home. They didn't talk about the lost years, just fixed a porch step and ate pancakes, building something new with silence and syrup. Another voucher took him to a community center in Seattle where he donated the airline's prepaid card to fix a leaking roof. He walked the old routes, handing out coffee and blankets. His sentences short, his presence enough. A man with a grocery cart asked, "You the guy from the plane?" Eli nodded, pouring soup. "Heard heaven's got turbulence," the man said, grinning. Eli smiled. "Probably. But maybe it's got better runways." Weeks later, at the airline's training center, Eli stood before a room of young pilots. His jacket unchanged, his voice steady. "Fly the plane," he told them, "not the ghosts. Ask for help before the stall horn. Build the runway in your head, even when the sky lies." The room was quiet. Then pens scratched notes taken. Mia stood in the back, her smile brighter than the storm. The lesson was clear: everyone, no matter how broken or invisible, carries the strength to change a moment, to save a life, to find a way home. Courage isn't a uniform or a title. It's the choice to stand. When every instinct says, sit, to act. When fear begs you to hide. Eli Carter. A man who'd lost his wings to grief found them again in a storm, proving that the sky doesn't care about your past, only your hands, and that every soul has a chance to be a hero, if only for one night.